Hello everyone. I'm generally not a fan of gimmicks, or as they're sometimes called, cheese. These are strategies that aren't very effective at a top level and often crumble if your opponent knows what you're up to. They tend to be extremely matchup dependent as well. You often practically win or lose the game at team preview. I enjoy making unique and underrated Pokemon legitimately work, building a team that utilizes their strengths to make a Pokemon people thought was bad turn into a monster. I don't want to rely on gimmicks, good matchups, or my opponent just having no idea what's going on. At least, I normally don't. But there are some gimmicky strategies that are so hilarious and fun that I can't help but enjoy them. I'm going to go over my top 5 favorite gimmick strategies in Generation 9 singles. I'll go over how each of these gimmicks work, how I built the team to support them, and lastly, why they can't work at a top level despite my best efforts. First up, we have Reverse Toxic Spikes. This one is absolutely hilarious. The idea is focused on making the most of Pokemon with the ability Guts. This boosts the Pokemon's attack stat by 1.5 times if it's statused, so Pokemon with Guts often run the Flame Orb to status themselves. This doesn't half their attack, by the way, that's another effect of Guts. So with the Flame Orb, these Pokemon essentially get a Choice Band boost, the upside being that they can switch up their moves, the downside being that they have to deal with the residual damage of being burned. One other upside is that Facade, a 70 base power normal attack, becomes 140 base power. Ursaluna is a particularly strong user of this, since it's a normal type, so Facade is Stab. One of the biggest issues with Guts Pokemon is that you have to use a Flame Orb. Once you're burned, this item is pretty much useless. That's where this Reverse Toxic Spikes idea comes into play. Unfortunately, there is no entry hazard that causes burns. This would certainly be ideal, as poison does a lot more damage than burn, but it gets the job done. You set Toxic Spikes, go into Cinderace, and Court Change, bringing the Toxic Spikes to your side of the field. Then, every time a Guts Pokemon enters the field, it gets poisoned, and since you knew you were going to use this strategy, of course, you don't have to put a Flame Orb on these Pokemon. On this team, I've got a Choice Scarf Heracross for speed control, an Assault Vest Conkeldurr that's insanely bulky and insanely strong at the same time, and a Choice Scarf Ursaluna that gets shockingly fast, up to 327 speed. These Pokemon are the strongest abusers of this strategy by far. There is technically also Zangoose, which has Toxic Boost, essentially Guts, but it only works with Poison, but its stats are pretty terrible. For the Toxic Spike setter, I chose Galarian Slowking. The reason for this is that you can use Future Sight to dissuade poison types from entering the field and removing your Toxic Spikes. The Cinderace set is a pretty standard Blaze variant, and the last slot is Kingambit, because the team had no resist to Normal, Flying, Psychic, Dragon, or Water, and Kingambit helps with all but Water. I also went with an Air Balloon set because the team is pretty weak to ground. That's also why I've got a Shuca Berry on Galarian Slowking. Also, a cool fact about this team is that it's often ideal to set 2 layers of Toxic Spikes. Unless your Guts Pokemon stays in for 4 or more turns, which is pretty rare, it's either equal or better to be badly poisoned. This squad is definitely threatening and can get some wins on actually solid teams. Despite this, it's still going to lose most of the time. As funny as this strategy is, it's just not worth using. First of all, Ursaluna is by far the best Guts Pokemon in Overused, and the strongest abuser. Conkeldurr and Heracross aren't terrible by any means, especially with Reverse Toxic Spike support, but they're not great either. Having to use these lower tier, not amazing Pokemon to really take advantage of this strategy isn't ideal. The bigger issue, though, is that if your opponent knows what you're up to, it's extremely easy for them to shut this strategy down if they have a Poison type to absorb Toxic Spikes. Sure, your Galarian Slowking can use Future Sight to pressure Poison types, but the most popular Poison type in Overused is other Galarian Slowking, which takes barely anything from a Future Sight. It's also very easy for your opponent to play in such a way that you never have the chance to reverse hazards before they're absorbed, even if your opponent has a Poison type that's weak to Future Sight. It takes a minimum of 3 turns to set Toxic Spikes, switch out or use Chilly Reception to bring in Cinderace, and Court Change. That's a lot of time for your opponent to do whatever they want. Bring in a Breaker, start setting up with a Sweeper, absorb your Toxic Spikes. That's another big reason this strategy isn't really worthwhile. But I will say, when it works, it really works. It's amazing to wipe out an entire team with a super speedy Ursaluna, or a Heracross, or just tank everything and hit like a truck with Conkeldurr. The team overall is definitely not viable, but using Guts Pokemon with powerful items is so fun. But as far as raw damage goes, this next gimmick is even more powerful. It's Echoed Voice Spam. For this, we're going to shift to the National Dex tier, a format that includes all Pokemon that have ever been in the game, as well as mechanics like Mega Evolution and Z-moves. Echoed Voice distribution was unfortunately gutted in Generation 9, so this strategy is pretty much dead in the mainline games this generation, but the National Dex format also grants Pokemon all of the moves they've ever been able to learn, so plenty of Pokemon get Echoed Voice. But why do we care? What can Echoed Voice actually do? Well, Echoed Voice is a weak move. It's a special normal move that's only 40 base power. But if used in direct succession, it increases by 40 base power each turn until it reaches a cap at a whopping 200 base power. So it'll be 40, then 80, then 120, 160, and on turn 5, 200. This may sound pretty terrible. After all, surviving for 5 turns when clicking a move that starts so weak is pretty unlikely. But here's the crazy thing. As long as Echoed Voice is successfully used every turn, the power boost continues, even if the Pokemon using Echoed Voice is KO'd. If the Pokemon using Echoed Voice is KO'd by a faster Pokemon, then the streak dies, since nothing on your team used Echoed Voice that turn. But if you use Echoed Voice, then you get KO'd, you can switch into another Pokemon and continue the Echoed Voice streak. If the strategy goes well, you'll be spamming 200 base power Echoed Voices over and over. It should also be noted that a lot of things you might think would break the chain actually don't. If you use Echoed Voice into a Ghost type, which of course is immune to normal, the chain is still maintained, and in fact continues to grow. If the opponent uses Protect, it also continues to grow and is not interrupted. As long as the move Echoed Voice is successfully used on that turn, whether it hits or deals damage or not, the streak continues and the power increases. Still, that is a major limitation, but this team was designed to minimize that limitation. For starters, speed is extremely important. As I said, being KO'd by a faster Pokemon ends the streak, so being faster is key. That's why we want Sticky Web, to make this strategy more likely to succeed. I went with Araquanid as I consider it the strongest and most consistent Sticky Web setter. To help ensure Sticky Web stays up, we needed a spin blocker, and funny enough, the only special attacking Ghost type that learns Echoed Voice is Mismagius. I gave it a Choice Scarf to give our team some additional speed control, and to help really make sure that nothing outspeeds it and breaks the streak. Priority is another concern. If your Echoed Voice Pokemon is KO'd by priority, same as getting KO'd by something faster, your streak is done. So we have Tapu Lele with a Terrain Extender to help with this. I also gave it Taunt to block Defog, and Tapu Lele also gets Echoed Voice, so it not only sets terrain, it can help the streak get started. Another big issue with Echoed Voice spam is that Ghost types are immune. That's why all of our main abusers have abilities that change the type of Echoed Voice. Mega Gardevoir is the star abuser of the team. With a full-powered Echoed Voice factoring in Pixelate, Gardevoir is clicking a 240 base power Fairy type move. That is insane. To give you an idea of how strong that is, it has a chance to 2-hit KO maximum special defense Toxapex. It also deals around half to Blissey. With choice specs though, Sylveon is even stronger. It similarly gets a 240 base power special attack, but more powerful. It's much slower, which is a huge issue for this team, but against those bulkier teams, Sylveon is destroying everything. It guaranteed 2-hit KOs Blissey. Lastly, we have Primarina with Liquid Voice for the Water-type Echoed Voice. Sadly, Liquid Voice doesn't get the 1.2 times boost like Pixelate, but it's still insanely powerful, and it gives the team another type of Echoed Voice. And I gave it a Choice Scarf to ensure it outspeeds almost everything. Keeping the streak alive is vital to making this team work. This strategy can go absolutely crazy and demolish some actually solid teams. Unfortunately, it often doesn't. For this team to work, everything needs to go right. It's very fragile. If your opponent manages to prevent you from setting Sticky Web, or they have a strong removal Pokemon, it's probably over. Without Sticky Web, it's very difficult to keep an Echoed Voice streak going. Your opponent also may just have a Heavy Duty Boots Pokemon that's fast and threatening. A Heavy Duty Boots Zamazenta with Heavy Slam, for example, is pretty much a loss at preview. Then there's also the problem of the massive amount of defensive weaknesses of this team. To justify using Echoed Voice, you really need to use these abusers, as they're the best there is, but then we end up with a team that's just weak to so much. We have no resist to Electric, Grass, Flying, Rock, Ghost, or Fairy. We also get destroyed by Toxic Spikes. The problem is though, if you try to patch up these weaknesses by adding less potent abusers or supporters, you weaken the effectiveness of the central strategy. Overall, it's just super gimmicky, inconsistent, matchup reliant, and there's no way to make it consistently work. But it is an absolute blast when it does. Also, if you want to use this strategy in Overused, I'd say Generation 8 is your best bet. I actually managed to get top 50 on the ladder with it back then. Now, this next strategy isn't considered nearly as fun, at least for your opponent. Unlike every other gimmick on this list, this one can take a while. It's based on trapping. Moves like Block and Mean Look trap the opposing Pokemon for an indefinite amount of time. It's theoretically permanent, but there are a lot of ways out. If you switch out, your opponent is now freed. If your opponent forces you to switch with a move like Roar or Whirlwind, that will also free them. They can also escape with a pivoting move like U-Turn or Volt Switch, and there are also items like the Eject button and Red Card. But if you do manage to use Block or Mean Look on a Pokemon that doesn't have any of those resources, they're stuck with you for potentially a very long time. This Slowbro set is a particularly nasty block Pokemon. With its insane physical defense, it can tank even super effective hits from many physical attackers. You can Calm Mind up, so special attackers can hardly do any damage either, heal off both status and damage with Rest, and once you've maxed out your stats, you can potentially wipe out your opponent's entire team with Scald. And thanks to Mega Slowbro's ability Shell Armor, you can't ever get critical hit as you boost up. This is a really broken strategy when it works. The problem is that nobody is just going to leave in a Pokemon that Slowbro can easily set up on. Sometimes they will, sure, you might trap a Clefable lead or something like that, but a lot of the most appealing targets to trap, like Great Tusk or Iron Treads, aren't wanting to stay in on Slowbro anyways. Your opponent will probably hard switch into something like Zapdos, Tapu Koko, Mega Charizard Y, something that destroys you. And if you use Block on them, they don't care. You'll be forced to switch out and free them immediately, or die. But what if your opponent couldn't switch? What if their Great Tusk or Iron Treads was trapped on the field for your Slowbro to use Block on? Well, there's one Pokemon that can achieve such a feat: Klefki. Klefki's signature move, Fairy Lock, prevents Pokemon from switching the following turn. It also has Prankster, which grants non-attacking moves priority, so this move will almost always go first. Pair this with an Eject button, an item that switches you out when the opponent attacks, and you get a very nasty trap. You can use Fairy Lock, and if your opponent attacks you, you'll pivot out with your Eject button. If the target is something that Slowbro can trap, you go into it and you use Block. On that turn, your opponent won't be able to switch out, and once Block is used, the trap becomes permanent. Slowbro is the strongest Pokemon to take advantage of this, but I've also got a Block Snorlax that works similarly, and a Mean Look Tapu Bulu. Once the Fairy Lock trap is sprung, you can go into whatever setup Pokemon best suits the situation. To round out the team, I also have a Speed Beast Boost Normalium Z Kartana and a Great Tusk. Fairy Lock can be used in other ways than just trapping. It can give Kartana a free turn of setup on a Pokemon that can't do much damage to it. I've also used Fairy Lock to trap Moltres on the field and KO it with a Head Smash from Great Tusk. This strategy is absolutely hilarious and extremely fun when it works, but your opponent will probably hate it, since boosting up to fully maxed out stats with these trappers can take a long time. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, this strategy isn't top level viable. It's certainly better than Reverse Toxic Spikes or Echoed Voice, but definitely not consistent. If your opponent knows your strategy and they know you have Fairy Lock, it's much harder to pull off. And a ton of Pokemon have pivoting moves that allow them to escape trapping. You'd be shocked by how few Pokemon are actually feasible to trap and set up on, so the team ends up being very matchup reliant. Still, this team isn't terrible, and can function even if Fairy Lock fails. In fact, this strategy has had ladder success before. Back in Generation 7, about 8 years ago, I collaborated with the user Bandissendat and me to make a team based on this Fairy Lock strategy, and they managed to hit rank 7 with it in Overused. That's probably the ideal generation for block Fairy Lock strategies. I'll link the Rate My Team forum post to that team in the description for those that are interested. The next gimmick I want to discuss also involves trapping, but of a very different kind. This strategy can only be pulled off by one Pokemon, Smeargle. For this gimmick, we're back in the Scarlet and Violet Overused tier. This strategy involves the signature move of Phalanx, no retreat. Before we get into that though, if you're enjoying the video so far, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps out a lot. So what does No Retreat do? This move provides an Omni boost, which is a one-stage boost to attack, speed, defense, and special defense. It's similar to Komo's Clangorous Soul, except it doesn't reduce the user's HP. This move sounds super broken, and it really is, but it has two big limitations. The first is that after using No Retreat, you can't switch out. This isn't a big deal though. After setting up, you generally want to stay on the field anyway. The bigger limitation is that you can only use this move once per time being on the field, so you can't stack No Retreats. If this limitation wasn't included, Phalanx would probably get banned from overused. However, there is one oddity in how this move is programmed. If Phalanx gets trapped before it uses No Retreat, it can use No Retreat over and over and over. Suppose your opponent uses Mean Look against you before you use No Retreat for the first time. Well, now your Phalanx can spam that Omni Boost move. Unfortunately, this isn't realistic. Trapping moves are very rare, and you can't rely on your opponent to use Mean Look or block against you. This will almost never happen. However, there is a way you can trap yourself. Jaw Lock, the signature move of Dreadnought, is very unique in that it traps both the user and the target. This would fulfill the condition to spam No Retreat. Now, of course, Phalanx doesn't learn Jaw Lock, but Smeargle does. Smeargle learns everything. Now, Smeargle has absolutely terrible defensive stats, but it has decent speed. So if you use Jaw Lock as a slower Pokemon uses a non-attacking move, you are now both trapped. You can use Encore to lock the Pokemon into that status move, then use No Retreat over and over again to get +6 in all stats. Then, finally, you use the last move of Power Trip. With all stats boosted, Power Trip is a 620 base power move. Despite Smeargle's terrible base 20 attack, with EV investment +6 attack, a 620 base power move, and Terra Dark to boost it further, nothing is taking this hit. Zamazenta with its defense boost is guaranteed to get one-hit KO'd. If your opponent gets jaw-locked on a slower Pokemon when using a non-attacking move, that's game over. That's why I put Smeargle on what appears to be a sticky web team. Smeargle is sometimes used as a sticky web setter, and it's very difficult to stop. With moves like Glare, Nuzzle, and Skill Swap, when paired with a Focus Sash, stopping Smeargle from setting up sticky web really isn't feasible unless you have a strong multi-hit move. So a lot of people simply decide to trade hazards instead. They'll allow Smeargle to set up sticky web in exchange for their Tinglu getting up a few layers of spikes. Except this Smeargle isn't sticky web, and if your opponent makes that mistake on turn 1, you win immediately. Now, despite the incredible potency of this gimmick, like everything else on this list, this strategy isn't at all good. It's completely unstoppable when it works, but it's probably the worst strategy we've gone over so far from a standpoint of competitive viability. Smeargle's defenses are terrible, so if your opponent happens to attack you, it's over immediately. Also, if your opponent knows what your Smeargle set is, it's absolutely super over. Nobody loses to this strategy more than once. The same cannot be said for the final gimmick we're going over, though. This is probably the most consistent one yet. F.E.A.R. It's the name of this strategy, and the emotion it induces. F.E.A.R stands for Focus Sash, Endeavor, Attack, typically Quick Attack, and Rattata. It's a classic strategy where a level 1 Rattata holding a Focus Sash can tank an attack from a level 100 Pokemon thanks to that Focus Sash, use Endeavor, a move which brings the target down to the user's HP, to bring that level 100 Pokemon down to 1 HP as well, and then Rattata can kill with Quick Attack the following turn. That's not what I'm using here, though. F.E.A.R has essentially become an all-encompassing term for all level 1 Endeavor users. In this case, my Pokemon of choice is Togedemaru. It has the ability Sturdy, so the Focus Sash is essentially already built in. This allows you to use a different item, the Shell Bell. This item makes all of your attacks heal you by 1/8 of the damage you deal to the target. Normally, this item is absolutely terrible and outclassed by leftovers. But for a level 1 Pokemon clicking Endeavor, you're doing so much damage relative to your absolutely tiny HP stat that the Shell Bell will almost always restore you to full health after you use Endeavor. This restores Sturdy, allowing Togedemaru to do this over and over again, eliminating the HP of level 100 Pokemon without losing any health itself. I gave it Toxic and Nuzzle as supporting moves to use in rare cases, and Spiky Shield to finish off Pokemon that I suspect will try to hit Togedemaru with a contact move. Endeavor is really the only relevant move though. That's what you'll be clicking almost every turn you're on the field. I paired Togedemaru with a smooth rock Hippowdon to keep sand on the field for as long as possible. Once Togedemaru uses Endeavor to bring the target to low health, Sandstorm will finish them off. Sand Chip hits even before Leftovers healing. Now, this may sound kind of broken, but as always, there are major limitations. The biggest one is that Endeavor is a normal type move, so ghost types are completely immune to this strategy. In Scarlet and Violet Overused, there is no way to work around this. You just have to hope you don't run into a ghost type. In National decks though, we have the move Pursuit. This 40 base power dark move doubles in power if the opponent tries to switch, and hits before they switch. It's great for trapping and killing ghost types, so I paired this Endeavor strategy with a Black Glasses King Gambit, the strongest Pursuit trapper in the format, to eliminate ghosts that try to stop Togedemaru. Another big issue with this strategy is hazards. If Togedemaru enters on Stealth Rock or Spikes, Sturdy is broken and it can be killed by anything. I have a core of Magic Bounce Mega Sableye and Defog Corviknight to keep hazards off the field if possible. Lastly, Togedemaru really struggles to enter the field. It obviously can't take any hits, so it really needs a safe entrance. Alomomola is great for this, and it can also heal up Togedemaru if it gets chipped by hazards or some other little bit of damage, like from a Rocky Helmet or an ability like Rough Skin. Normally, it would be the end of Togedemaru to get chipped a little bit like that in a game, but Alomomola grants it a lot of longevity. This is one of the few strategies that even if your opponent knows exactly what's going on, they still might not be able to stop it. Really solid teams can lose to this strategy. Still, it's definitely not good. For starters, multi-hit moves can completely end Togedemaru instantly. Also, Steel, Rock, or Ground types don't take Sand Chip, so although Togedemaru can certainly get them to low health, it can't kill them. As I mentioned, Ghost types can also switch in for free to Togedemaru, and King Gambit sometimes fails to kill with Pursuit trapping. Gholdengo can use Focus Blast, or Pecharunt is bulky enough that Pursuit doesn't do enough damage after Parting Shot. This Endeavor strategy isn't horrible, but it's not consistent enough to really be justifiable at a top level. If you want to try this out in Overused, I'd say it works best in Generation 7, the last generation with Pursuit. Well, those are my top 5 gimmick strategies. Let me know in the comments what your favorite gimmick strategy is. I'm excited to see what you guys say, and I wonder if I'll hear anything I haven't heard of before. And remember, if you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.